Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, December 23rd, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Wisconsin and a massive victory the Democrats have won in this state according to the state Supreme Court that just struck down Wisconsin's legislative maps on an issue that it violated the state's constitutional mandate that legislative districts must be continuous. In this 4-3 decision, the state of Wisconsin is now mandating that the legislative maps are entirely redrawn, sending it back to the Republican legislature. But if they cannot agree with the Democratic governor, Tony Evers, well, Wisconsin will be set to send new maps to the courts from both sides of the aisle, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court will choose the ultimate map. This decision from the liberal justices, a 4-3 decision, liberal justices to conservative justices, is one that has been a long time coming. When Democrats won the Wisconsin Supreme Court race back in 2023, it was a major victory for Democrats all across the country because it showed that in a state like Wisconsin, number one, in an off-election year, Democrats were able to win. It was a very, very big victory. It was one that really showed that Roe v. Wade and the issue of abortion was very prevalent, especially in elections where maybe not everybody is paying attention. But in Wisconsin, it was a show of display that Democrats still had a very strong backing and support of people who vote at a very high rate, very different than things that we had known prior to. But that was the national takeaway. That was what we talked about on this channel. We talked about how this was going to have implications for how Democrats approach state Supreme Court races, how they were going to go about replicating Janet Protasiewicz, how to become the next her in states like Pennsylvania, which they did this past November. But the very big implications that weren't really discussed too heavily are the implications of what this meant for the statewide level in the state of Wisconsin. Officially, for the first time in a long time, Wisconsin had a liberal majority on their state Supreme Court. And just one day after Janet Protasiewicz was sworn in as a justice, Democratic plaintiffs went on the offense against Republicans and put forth a case here to get new legislative maps. And as is said very angrily by the conservative justices in the Wisconsin court, these arguments about non-continuous districts were not raised during the conservative majority, but rather during the liberal one. But just as the Republican Senate leader here has actually said very accurately for this map too, is that the decision on this race, the decision on these legislative maps was decided before the case was even brought forth before the court. And so this was actually a bit of contention back in the Wisconsin race. I don't know if you entirely remember, but looking back at the 2023 race, Janet Protasiewicz, when she was campaigning, said that the maps were unfair, that they were illegal, that should she be in a position to be a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, she would back striking them down. So she sort of campaigned on an anti-gerrymandering portion of her campaign. The Republicans were completely in the offense, even threatening to try to impeach her because they do have a supermajority, which may no longer last now that the legislative maps have to be redrawn. But that was since walked back because many Republicans actually were unwilling to get on board with impeaching somebody that voters had just backed by 10 points across the state. They knew the electoral pushback should that come to fruition. But the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, now with a liberal majority here, is striking down the maps. And now let's talk about why that's a huge win for Democrats across the state. Now, number one, we have to recognize that Wisconsin has a Democratic governor. Tony Evers was first elected back in 2018 when he beat Scott Walker, who was running for a third term as governor of Wisconsin. So when Tony Evers defeated Scott Walker, it was a margin of around 0.4%, something around there. Let's actually take a look at the governor's race because I want to see what the very narrow margin was. Oh, around 1.1%, right? So fast forward to 2022, everybody's thinking, okay, there's no reality in which Tony Evers wins because it's a red wave year. This was a Democrat plus 8 year, and Tony Evers at best could win by 1. He's screwed in 2023. Didn't end up happening. In 2023, he ends up winning by a margin of around 3 to 4 points across the state. A very big victory and one that was not expected or predicted by the polls, by the pundits, by anyone really. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that Tony Evers was a sleeper candidate, including the Senate race, which Ron Johnson, which on polling was supposed to win by 4.5%, ended up winning by 0.5%. So you see some major differences in the Senate race versus the governor's race here, and that's because the polling was overestimating Republicans quite significantly. But long story short, Tony Evers is reelected as the Democratic governor, but he's gridlocked. He can't do much because coinciding with these governor elections are the 2022 Wisconsin State Assembly elections, in which Republicans win 64 seats to the Democratic Party's 35. And so in this race, Democrats look at this and say, you know what, we're screwed going into 2024. We're screwed going into the remainder of this decade. Even with a Democratic governor, there's nothing we can do because the state assembly here is Republican. And it isn't just the state assembly, too. It's also the Wisconsin State Senate. Let's see if we can navigate our way through the Wikipedia depths. But if we look at the Wisconsin 2022 elections, we will see the coinciding Senate races. The coinciding Senate elections were very much lopsided in favor of the GOP as well. The GOP gets 22 seats to the Democratic Party's 11. 22 out of 33 seats. That's a majority. That's a super majority in many, many cases. So Wisconsin State's Senate, very lopsided to the GOP. The state assembly, very lopsided to the GOP. But you look at the popular vote and you're wondering, okay, well, you know, you're telling me that this is a lopsided margin. Maybe it was just, sure, a little bit of gerrymandering, but the Republicans still won the popular vote by around 9 points. Doesn't that mean that Republicans are having a reflective response or a reflective answer in terms of their actual seats won? Well, the answer is no, because Democrats don't run candidates in many of the races that Republicans are determined going to win. Same case in the Senate races. You can see here that sure, Republicans might have won 61% of the vote to the Democratic Party's 37.68. And I do want to caution this and say that similar to how we see the national Senate races, they sort of alter off every 2 years to a point where there will be 17 seats up in one and then 16 seats up in the next. But regardless, what we're looking at the Senate race here is that sure, it might at face value seem as if this is a fair map, but let's go all the way back to 2018. When we saw Tony Evers win his election for the first time, this was when there was a big deal for Democrats in Wisconsin. Well, first I want to look at the Senate races. I think that's going to be a little bit less interesting because, again, only about half the seats are up. In 2018, Republicans only had around 19 seats. Democrats had 14. The map was a little bit more favored towards Democrats, and the margin was a lot closer. Republicans did pick up a seat here, but regardless, though, it was around 19 to 14. Okay, that's reasonable. But let's take a look at 2018, because that's where we really find the shocker. Going back to 2018, you can see here that Democrats won the statewide state assembly vote. They got candidates in many of the races and won by 53 to 45. 53 to 45. Putting that in perspective, that is an 8-point margin of victory. That's nearly double what Joe Biden had over Donald Trump in the 2020 election. An 8-point margin of victory has not happened on the national margin in terms of the popular vote even before Obama really was when it happened, because Obama had won by around 7 points. You look at 2018 and see that Democrats won the popular vote across the state by 8 points. Guess how many seats they won out of a total number of 99? Just 36. Democrats in a wave year, in an 8-point increase from the last election, 2016, in terms of their support, won just one more seat over the GOP. It was a clear display of partisan gerrymandering, and Democrats took note of that. But they knew that the Wisconsin State Supreme Court was never going to side with them. They had Republican justices through in and throughout, and so what they needed to do was win over the Wisconsin State Supreme Court elections. And the precursor election to this one actually was with the same Republican nominee who was meant to keep that seat in the conservative column, and he lost the race. And so Democrats, actually might have been the incumbents there, but regardless, won that race against Daniel Kelly. He comes back in 2023, and he says, this is my time. Now I'm going to make it onto the state Supreme Court. The voters say absolutely not. Janet Protasiewicz is our girl. She's going to end up with the Supreme Court justice, right? She's going to be there, and she's going to represent Wisconsin's interests better. And so that's where you found a lot of trouble for the GOP, because they ran the same candidate twice, and Republicans have been counting on a victory in these elections. And in most cases, in historical elections, Republicans would benefit the most from an April 4th general election. The reason being that the most likeliest voters in the entire country historically have been Republicans. You think about the racial demographic groups that Democrats and Republicans win white voters, the most likely group to vote in terms of racial demographic group. You think about age. Older voters tend to be more conservative. The most likely age group to vote are older voters as you get older and older and older. That's why Democrats are always talking about we need to turn out the youth. We need to turn out the Gen Zers, right? You also think about it, too, from the perspective of money. Think about who's most likely to vote. It's certainly not people in the bottom 50% of the country, bottom 90% really of the wealth distribution bracket. It's the people who are in the top 10%. The top 1%, even the top 0.1%, has a turnout rate of nearing 98%. So when you think about that, when you think about the type of election or the party that would benefit the most from an April 4th general election pre-Dobbs, has always been the Republican Party. always low turnout elections have benefited the GOP because their base was the most likely to vote. And so now fast forward post Dobbs v. Jackson, a year and a half later, or at that time, just around a year later, Democrats see a huge bump, a huge benefit from low turnout elections, including this one where they actually turned out quite a few people. But it wasn't the low turnout part that made it beneficial for Democrats. It was the fact that they had inspired a group of people to vote on issues like abortion and gerrymandering in a race where this would have direct implications for such. If there was a case around Wisconsin's abortion law and that was brought forth to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, they could strike it down. In an issue like gerrymandering and an issue like these legislative districts are brought forth to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, they could strike it down. And you might be wondering, okay, are there implications beyond just potentially narrowing up the Wisconsin State Assembly and the State Senate? Because the electoral ramifications of this redraw is that Democrats could very well end up in the majority in the Wisconsin State Senate. Looking at the Wisconsin State Assembly, that's not a guarantee, but we will see what happens. If the Republican legislature tries to gerrymander again, I'm telling you now, they're going to try to do it. They always do, and they always fail to do so. Tony Evers is going to say no. It's going to get sent to the courts. They're going to ask for maps from both sides of the aisle, and they said openly, if we have to, we will take into account partisan composition, meaning, and they said this in their quote as well, they don't want to favor either side of the aisle over each other, which means they won't choose a map that gives Republicans an inherent upper advantage or Democrats, which means we could end up with a truly fair map, which means in case like 2022, where maybe we just take everything at face value, Republicans winning the majority means they win the state assembly. 2018 would be a different story, where Democrats would, in fact, win the state assembly in the event that they win there. It wouldn't be Republican control decade after decade after decade because Republicans know how to draw these maps so effectively, and the Democratic governor is practically rendered useless. Looking at the state Senate elections, though, for whatever reason, the maps look like they could be more favorable to Democrats. I'm not entirely sure the mathematics behind that, but I was looking at what the pundits were saying, what the takeaways and the ramifications of were this. But again, we're looking beyond. What is beyond? For me, that's congressional maps. For me, that is wondering, does this mean Wisconsin will redraw their congressional maps? Now, this has already been litigated. Democrats have already tried to strike down the Wisconsin congressional maps. And in many cases, too, this map is not too bad. The 3rd congressional district is right here, where Democrats almost won. It was a 4-point margin. The Democratic Party spent $0 on this race. Why, you might ask? It's a 4-point race. They didn't know. They thought 2022 was all defense. They thought they were not going to be playing offense in many of these states. And in states like Wisconsin, and it was also particular in the state of Arizona, where you found districts like Arizona's 1st, which national Democrats spent $0 in. You found here that Republicans won by 1 point. Well, it's competitive. Arizona's 6th, Democrats spent $0 in. Ends up being a 1.5% district, right? So Democrats now know, for the better, for 2022, where to target, for 2024 rather, where to target, where to spend money, and what was competitive, despite it never needing to be in the first place. Wisconsin. In this 3rd district, Democrats are now going to fund the money into this race. You also find that the 1st district here also was competitive. 8.9%, it shouldn't have been. In 2020, the 1st district was decided by 18.7. In 2018, it was a lot closer. Marginally, 12.3%. Democrats also were able to win with Ron Kind in the 3rd district by 19.3. In 2020, narrowed up to 2.7 though. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Donald Trump was running at the top of the ticket. But regardless, the 3rd district was 2.7% for Democrats. And so Ron Kind said, I'm leaving. But it still wasn't that, lopsided in favor of the GOP. But this map itself, you find that the state Supreme Court wouldn't have much to strike it down upon. In fact, in most cases where we've seen maps like this struck down, it doesn't go to the state Supreme Court. It goes to a federal court, which is why you can appeal further to the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Republicans have also said they are going to try to appeal this decision. I can say this, the United States Supreme Court has already said before they will not have a role in deciding partisan gerrymandering claims, and Republicans are going to say, this is about contiguous districts, yada, yada, yada. The state Supreme Court is justified in their decision. Objectively, the state constitution does declare that the maps that the Republicans have drawn is unfair. Are the Republican claims merited that Democrats only brought this forth once they won the majority? Absolutely. That's true, but that's politics, and everybody knew that was going to happen. So no, I don't think the Supreme Court's going to step in Wisconsin. If they do, I think they're going to reaffirm the state Supreme Court's decision. Otherwise, it opens up a Pandora's box about what Democrats could do across the country in the states where they have, majority states like Kansas even, where maybe they could find a new way to relitigate that, even if it's explicitly declared in the state constitution. If the Supreme Court can say you don't need to use that as the governing document, you're going to find Democrats are going to be pushing a lot further back. They know the ramifications of this extend beyond Wisconsin, so they might just say, take the GOP, right? For right now, Wisconsin is where we need you to stay. But just looking at what the possibilities are, I don't know if the congressional maps are the way to go. Right now, this map would be in a blue wave year, potentially 4-4, which is probably the best Democrats are going to get. I don't know a configuration or a map that makes this more fair. I think what we have seen is that marginally maybe there would be improvements in districts like the 3rd, marginal improvements in districts like the 1st, but that would take, in some cases, an intentional drawing in favor of Democrats. The reason why this popular vote 2 on the right is so lopsided 56-40 is because Democrats didn't run candidates in Wisconsin's 6th. They didn't run candidates in Wisconsin's 8th. They did in the 7th, though, and they did in the 5th, so those were narrow up, but 56-40 again is not an accurate depiction of what the vote was like in 2022. I'd go with the governor's vote, which is why we look at the Wisconsin State Assembly and we realize, okay, this absolutely does not make the same, it does not make the mark the way that it should based on what we know about the Wisconsin election in 2022. So this is a big win for Democrats. They, for the first time in over a decade now, have a very, very reasonable shot at winning back control of potentially the state assembly and a very good, very, very good shot, actually, of winning back the state senate. We will see what happens in Wisconsin in 2024. I don't imagine we will see a redraw of the congressional maps in 24, maybe in 26. We'll talk about that in future videos. But for right now, still a very big win for Democrats. And it could end up in a situation like Minnesota or Michigan or Pennsylvania, where Democrats for the first time in sometimes decades are winning back trifectas and are able to enact major change across the state and thus continue winning more elections. And we will see too, because the court system is now 4-3, maybe Democrats will have a fair map for this time, but if they're able to make the majority by 2030, maybe they'll draw themselves in the same way Republicans did, and if the court composition doesn't change, nothing is going to happen for the national GOP. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. Check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.